Welcome back to Mental Health, where we look at social issues, politics, and pop culture through a mental health lens. And today I want to talk about something that has been on a lot of politicians' minds and speaking notes as of late, and that is lowering of the voting age. And I want to talk about why this is a terrible idea, or at least I think so. And it made sense to me to cover this topic here just because there's been a lot of discussion around science denial. And, you're a science denier because you don't believe in climate change, and you're a science denier because of how you feel about gender, and yada, yada, yada. So what I want to do here is give you a scientific argument against lowering the voting age. And we have to start by going back to brain structure, which if you've been listening to a lot of these podcasts, you've probably heard me say this before, but put really simply, let's kind of look at the structure and development of your brain. So if you just hold out your hand in front of you right now and you fold your thumb into your palm, at that point, your wrist is representing like your brainstem, and your thumb is representing these kind of lower, more reptilian, animalistic parts of your brain that are associated with more emotional reactivity, fight or flight response, more basic level functions. And then if you fold the rest of your fingers over your thumb, this is now your neocortex. And the thing is that all those lower parts of your brain develop very rapidly. In fact, within the first 3 years of your life, that lower part of your brain is pretty much good to go, which is why, as I've said before, that early trauma, especially in those first 3 years, can be so damaging because you're basically causing brain damage to critical parts of your brain that allow you to manage your emotions and your anxiety in particular and feel safe. And if you don't have the right development, right attachment, and experiences around that time, it can be very damaging. But more importantly, what I want to talk about today is that last part, because the rest of your brain, the neocortex, doesn't develop fully until they say you're about 25, or now they're even saying it's even later than that. So it takes a long time. Now, what's housed in that higher part of the brain? We're talking critical thinking, impulse control, abstract thinking, all those higher level functions that only human beings are capable of and that are more so associated with getting older, being more mature, being more knowledgeable. It's the things that we also complain about all the time that if you have kids, especially if you have teenagers, let me tell you, a common phrase is usually, man, I wish you would just listen to what I'm telling you to do. I wish you'd stop doing the same thing over and over again. I wish you would think before you did something. Guess what? There's a reason why they have trouble with that. It's not fully developed yet. It's literally, they're not functioning at full capacity in the ways that more higher functioning adults are. So how does this relate to the voting age? Well, pretty simply, actually. What skills are important for informed voting? And I say informed voting because I want to be clear that I think it's important that if you're a voter, you should be voting on the issues. You should be aware of the policies. You should be at least somewhat aware of the research and what the opposing argument is and the reasons behind all of that. And so to me, that's informed voting, is not just, oh, I like them, I'm going to vote for them. Now, that requires skills like gathering and disseminating multiple pieces of information, weighing pros and cons of all those things, considering hypothetical impact of policies in the future and how things are actually going to play out, weighing your needs versus the needs of other people who may have different needs, reading between the lines and separating what the politicians are saying versus what they're actually doing and what they've done in the past, how they've enacted policies years before, etc., etc., etc. So where are those skills based in the brain? In that higher part of the brain, in the neocortex, the part of the brain that's not fully developed until you're 25 or maybe even older than that. These are all higher level functions managed by the parts of your brain that they literally do not have yet. So how does it make sense to give kids who literally do not have full capacity to comprehend and disseminate and work through all of these key pieces of information? And not everyone. I know some young people who are definitely kind of mature beyond their years and do actually look into these pieces, but that's kind of the exception. On average, these kids do not have the skill set necessary to make really good informed choices, which is why frequently they don't. Now, that's not all to say that kids shouldn't be involved in politics. In fact, I think it's good for them to get involved in politics and begin learning all of these skills early on, because just like practicing a sport, just like learning to play an instrument, learning a language, that practice and that early skill building with adults who know what they're talking about and are providing them with a wide array of information, that is going to allow literal neuronal connections to form in their brain. There's a saying from Dan Siegel that where attention goes, neural firing flows, and neural connections grow. And that's just a fancy way of saying that the more you do something, the more you think about something, the more you draw attention to it and do it over and over again through repetition, the more that fires off neurons in your brain, and that literally forms new pathways that make it easier and easier and your skill set to grow in that area. So yes, it's important to give kids those experiences to start developing those areas. But let's not just hand them the reins, because they're basically on training wheels at this point. It's up to us as adults to help coach them through this to become fully functioning adults and, in this case, fully informed voters. To me, just lowering the voting age and just having them start voting is the equivalent of just tossing a kid in the ocean and hoping that they learn to swim. And that may seem hyperbolic, but I just really want to make the point that, again, they don't have the skills necessary yet. And we have to recognize that kids, and especially adolescents, are much more driven by their emotional centers of their brain at this age, which, as I've said in previous episodes, is not a good place to make sound decisions. When you're emotional, that literally pulls resources away from the higher order parts of your brain. They've shown this in brain scamming. They've done research on this, that the more anxious, especially, you are in a situation, the more emotionally charged it is, the more reactive you're getting, the less that your higher order, very important abstract thinking centers of your brain are able to deal with the situation. They're basically going offline. Or if you look at that little hand model of the brain, which I kind of described at the beginning, it's basically the equivalent of flip your fingers that were curled over your thumb, flip them back up again. That's what you're dealing with now. You're dealing with the lower areas of your brain, which are much more reptilian. And unfortunately, people in this state are much more easily manipulated by propaganda, fake or stilted news, emotionally driven sob stories, empty platitudes, rebellious political music, etc., etc., etc. And that's not me necessarily blaming those things for the problem. It's me saying that they're much more susceptible to that. This is part of why young people are more likely to hold left-leaning viewpoints, because the things in their lives are much more catered towards those things, and they relate to them more. They just connect more to emotional things. And conservative ideology just tends to be less of that. It tends to be more about numbers and facts, and there's nothing generally very sexy about it. And then add in the effects of hormone changes and increased sensitivity to stress reactions, and you've got potential voters who are largely functioning in that lizard brain. So as such, I consider it to be exploitive to consider them for the vote. It's easy to pitch this as a nice, give young people a voice. Like, anyone could hear that slogan, and that's one of those empty platitudes to me. Is like, anyone can hear that and be like, oh, that sounds great. And if you're not thinking about it, if you're not taking that extra second to be like, okay, let me consider what I think about that and what that actually means. If you're just taking it at face value, give young people a voice. That sounds great. Who could possibly, what evil person could possibly stand against that and say that we should shut those voices down? Because clearly, if you're not for giving them voices, then you're for shutting them up and pushing them into a corner. Like, that's the way these things get swung all the time. But really, let's face it, this slogan is not about the kids at all. It's about getting free votes. Again, young people, more emotional, more easily swayed by the stories they hear around them, stories they hear from adults who tend to be left-leaning and are pushing on really emotional messaging and in the news. They're much more likely to respond to that, and therefore lowering the voting age basically accounts to how do we get more Democratic votes. And this isn't me just picking on the Democrats, because God knows the conservatives have their little ways of doing this and have done this in the past too, where how can we just figure out to get more voters on our side, which is a huge problem. And honestly, on that note, I view this lowering the voting age as being almost on par with any attempts that have been made to suppress the minority vote. because it's basically you're looking for the same outcome. You're trying to sway the vote in one direction or another, and it's a terrible thing. It's about the numbers. It's not about the needs and desires of the people, and once more, it's unscientific. This is brain science. This is neurology. This is important stuff to understand. I feel like the more we could understand our own brains and how they function and where their weaknesses are, we could go so much further as a society. We need to recognize that, especially in the case of young people, there's a reason why they're supposed to be learning from adults, because not only have the adults just had more life experiences, but literally those life experiences have grown their brain to a point where they're able to actually do a good job with handling the copious amounts of information out there and better come to fully formed, effective, long-term solutions. Even on a personal level, I honestly feel like I shouldn't have been allowed to vote until probably my mid to late 20s, because my first few votes looking back were not based on policy. It was all about slogans and optics. Does it sound good? Does it make me feel good? Are the other people around me endorsing it? Does the other side make me feel bad in comparison? Hey, all of these adults on MSNBC and CNN seem to think that these other people are the evil empire, and I love Rage Against the Machine, so clearly this is the right way to vote. Like, literally, that's more or less what my mentality is. And that's not to say that I'm everybody and I'm representative of everybody. There, again, are young people out there who are probably much more informed voters than I was. But on average, again, the people around me, the people I was talking about, nobody was talking about policy. We were basically still voting for a prom king, not a president. I believed I knew everything, but I was still, to put it simply, naive and stupid. And that's fine. Like, that's not a bash on kids. It's just that simply you lack the skills at this point. But you will have them. Get out there. Get involved. Learn things. Pick up mentors, especially people who have a wide variety of different opinions that can give you different input. And you can start to learn how to kind of walk between those things and decide how you actually think about it. Again, I love kids. I think that they should be challenged more and could be challenged more. And it would be a great benefit from a more calculated, kind of gradual exposure approach to get them into politics. I'm all for that. In fact, I think that could lead to a much better tomorrow and adults better equipped to work together and solve problems in more lasting and effective ways. But giving them the vote, to quote Simon Cowell, it's a no from me. Honestly, there's a lot of adults who probably shouldn't be voting either, but that's an entirely different issue. I did an episode on kind of the pitfalls of engaging in activism, especially when you're a former victim or somebody who's just generally emotionally charged about the topic. And I think it cuts into a lot of what I have to say about adults too in that area. And that's in the two-parter episode that also talks about Jussie Smollett. If you're interested, I'll make sure that the link pops up at the end of this one. But yeah, it's just one of those things that drives me crazy because working in this field, like, I see it day in, day out. Kids, on average, make horrible decisions, and that's kind of part of their journey. That's part of something they need to work on, and I don't feel like it's appropriate to bring that into the realm of politics, even more than it already is, because let's face it, it's kind of a shit show right now. But I'm hopeful, and my one goal is, again, this is nothing to do with me demonizing the Democrats or demonizing Republicans, conservative, liberal, leftist even. I don't care. I just want people to be informed and recognize, like, okay, here's something that you need to factor in as we're having this conversation. And I'm hoping to hear more people talk about it, because I hear a lot of arguments for and against changing the voting age, but I don't hear too many people talking about the science behind it. And there is science that we need to consider. Most of what I'm hearing is just simply, again, kind of opinion of, well, I just feel this way and I feel this way. I definitely have feelings about this because I'm a human being. But I also have a lot of background and experience, and I've read research, and I've worked directly with kids for a long time now, long enough to recognize what I feel like are relatively unbiased thoughts on the matter. So do with that what you will. Thank you as always for listening, and I will leave you with the words of our wise sages, who I hear are making a new movie, actually. Bill S. Preston Esquire and Ted Theodore Logan, in saying, be excellent to each other. And party on, dudes.
to war.